I live in a pleasant suburban neighborhood in the Midwest, tucked away behind rows of maple trees and split-level houses with neatly trimmed lawns. It's a peaceful place, at least. That was my belief until I found myself tangling with an unlikely nemesis. The newly self-appointed enforcer of our homeowners association rules, Barbara Farnett, though nearly everyone around here calls her Karen. I've always loved music. When I first moved into this house, one of the best things about it was a small sunroom at the back, an enclosed space with big windows overlooking a modest yard. That sunroom quickly became my personal music studio. I used it for practice sessions on my acoustic guitar, sometimes experimenting with gentle loops on a small digital keyboard. My style veered toward mellow ballads and low-tempo grooves, so I never imagined I was disturbing anyone, especially since I only played during daytime hours. Looking out through those sunroom windows, I often gazed at the neighborhood. Joggers shuffling along the sidewalk, kids trundling past with backpacks and bright sneakers after school, an occasional father tossing a baseball with his son in the yard. On breezy days, I cracked the windows open so my guitar chords could mingle with the rustle of leaves. It was a quiet kind of joy. Then, about 6 months after I'd moved in, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox. Bold lettering on the front read, Magnolia Heights Homeowners Association, Notice of Potential Violation. For a heartbeat, I wondered if it might be a mistake, perhaps addressed to the wrong house. But inside was a brief, typed letter, signed by none other than B. Farnett, HOA Compliance Officer. It read, Dear Resident, we have received complaints regarding excessive noise potentially originating from your home. Please be aware that under HOA guidelines, noise levels should remain respectful of neighbors at all times. We suggest corrective measures to avoid further action. Thank you for your immediate attention to this matter. Sincerely, Barbara Farnett, Magnolia Heights HOA. I stared at the letter, perplexed. I'd only been playing music between 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, well within any typical quiet hour restrictions that usually began at 10 p.m. Some days, I only played for half an hour. The volume seldom rose above normal speaking range. My acoustic was neither electrified nor amplified. I decided there had to be some misunderstanding. Perhaps someone else had been making noise, and the complaint was erroneously directed at me. Or maybe there was a new neighbor who disliked any sound at all. Resolving to clarify the situation, I shot off a polite email to the HOA, requesting more information and offering reassurance that I wasn't playing late at night. Little did I know, that email was just the opening salvo in a drawn-out battle of pettiness, double standards, and late-night dish-clinking parties that would test the limits of neighborly civility. An HOA can be a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it keeps property values stable and ensures that everyone's yard meets a certain standard of upkeep. On the other hand, you sometimes encounter those who treat the HOA bylaws like a personal power trip. That was Barbara Farnett. Barbara was, by all external appearances, an ordinary middle-aged woman with short, neatly styled hair and a fondness for pastel cardigans. In conversation, she favored a condescending sweetness, speaking with an air of, trust me, I know best. A relative newcomer to the neighborhood, Barbara had wasted no time in joining the HOA. While the association officially had a president, a genial man named Ron Walters, who had lived here for decades, Barbara had seized the compliance officer position and effectively turned it into her domain. She would march around the block, clipboard in hand, jotting notes about who left their trash cans out too long, who dared to display wind chimes that apparently violated some aesthetic standard, and whose lawn had grown a millimeter too high. If your kid left a scooter on the driveway, you could expect a typed note shoved into your mailbox demanding that you clear the clutter. The neighbors quietly grumbled, but few bothered to fight her. After all, confronting Barbara meant dealing with a wave of official-sounding threats, citing bylaw sections as though they were holy writ. When I emailed the HOA after receiving my noise complaint, it was she who replied with a form letter, stating that repeated offenses could lead to fines. I decided to see if I could speak to her in person. Maybe I could reason with her. I found her phone number in the neighborhood directory, gave her a call, and asked if we could discuss the issue. She answered with sugary politeness. Oh, yes, I remember your case, she said, though her tone dripped with the subtext. You are a troublemaker. I'm sorry, but I have received multiple complaints about your loud music. Some neighbors work from home, you know. They can't possibly concentrate with the incessant strumming. Incessant strumming? I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. I only practice for a limited time during the day. I even keep the windows closed most of the time. She replied. Well, I'm just doing my job here. Our goal is to preserve the peace and quiet of Magnolia Heights. But if you claim it's not that loud, maybe I should come and check the noise level personally. We'll see if it's truly as mild as you say. I wasn't sure if inviting her into my home was wise, but I didn't want to escalate things. I offered, sure, if that helps resolve this. She agreed to come the following afternoon. I braced myself for a potentially uncomfortable visit. The next day, Barbara arrived precisely at 2 in the afternoon, wearing that pastel cardigan, a plastic badge that read HOA Compliance Officer, and a prim expression. She also carried a decibel meter that looked like she'd just purchased it online. I led her through the living room into my sunroom. I'd set my acoustic guitar on a stand near a small amplifier that I used on rare occasions, though usually at very low volume. She eyed both items suspiciously, like they were contraband. All right, I said. Let's do a brief demonstration. I'll play for a minute or so. You can measure the decibels. She nodded, flipping on the device. I strummed softly, purposely trying to replicate how I typically played. The meter hovered in a range roughly equivalent to normal conversation volume. Barbara frowned, tapping the meter as though she expected it to read something drastically higher. Are you sure this is how you usually play? She asked pointedly. I shrugged. Yes, this is basically the same volume. I'm not a rock guitarist blasting with amps. It's an acoustic guitar. She sniffed. I see. I explained again that I kept my music restricted to midday or early afternoon. I rarely went past 5 in the evening, to respect anyone who might have an early bedtime. She responded with a vague murmur, jotted a note on her clipboard, and then turned off the meter. As the HOA's compliance officer, I have to remain impartial, she said. However, multiple neighbors have reported your music travels farther than you think. Please ensure that your windows remain closed at all times during your sessions, or we may have to issue official sanctions. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Instead, I forced a polite smile. All right, I appreciate you coming by to measure it. Barbara gave a perfunctory nod and swept out of my house. I was left standing in the sunroom, guitar in hand, with a feeling of unease. This woman seemed bent on controlling the narrative. Even if my music was proven to be at a moderate volume, she was determined to find something to fault me for. That night, I got dinner started, hoping that perhaps the matter would rest. Little did I realize, I'd just scratched the surface of Barbara's need for control and her glaring hypocrisy. That weekend, I was startled awake by an odd clamor echoing across my backyard. At first, I thought it might be rowdy teenagers partying, but the sound carried a certain adult bustle, distinct conversations, laughter, and the unmistakable clink of dishes and glassware. It was 1:45 in the morning. Dragging myself out of bed, I shuffled to the window, parted the curtains, and discovered that the noise was coming from Barbara's house. Her back porch lights were ablaze, and there seemed to be a gathering in full swing. I could see silhouettes of people holding wine glasses, and every so often, a raucous burst of laughter spiked above the general hum. I glanced at my clock. 1:49 a.m. I knew that our neighborhood had a quiet hours policy strictly enforced from 10 p.m. until 7 a.m. The same woman who'd just insisted I keep my windows closed while playing an acoustic guitar in the afternoon was now presiding over what seemed like a late-night dinner party. The irony was palpable. At first, I tried to ignore it, closing the window, putting in earplugs, and attempting to go back to sleep. But the tinkling of silverware, the bursts of braying laughter, the occasional shriek of cheers seeped through. At around 2:30 a.m., I realized my frustration had reached its limit. I considered calling the police, but I hesitated. Was I really going to call the cops on my HOA's compliance officer? That felt like a nuclear option. Instead, I used my phone to capture about 40 seconds of the noise, focusing on the distinctly audible dish clinks. Then I turned on a white noise machine, covered my head with a pillow, and prayed it would end soon. It did, somewhere around 3 a.m. The next morning, I was groggy and irritated, feeling the aftertaste of injustice. If Barbara's party was an isolated incident, I might have dismissed it. But the next weekend, it happened again. This time, the noise carried on until nearly 2:30 a.m. And again, I recorded snippets, capturing the same loud chatter, the same shrill laughter, as though the participants didn't care about any sleeping neighbors. I was starting to see the shape of a double standard. Barbara had hammered me for noise in the daytime, yet she was orchestrating boisterous gatherings into the wee hours. By the third weekend, I had multiple short recordings, enough to compile a clear timeline. But before I took action, I decided to see if a civil conversation might work. Monday morning, I placed a friendly phone call to Barbara's number. She didn't pick up, so I left a voicemail in a calm, measured tone. "Hi, this is your neighbor, the one you visited about the music complaint. I've noticed some late-night noise from your house recently, and it's been difficult to sleep. I was wondering if we could chat about it." No response. I tried again 2 days later. This time, Barbara answered. "Yes," she said, her voice clipped. I reintroduced myself. "I wanted to mention the late-night gatherings at your place. The noise has been carrying quite far, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but our HOA does have quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. A pause. Then her tone shifted into scathing politeness. "I'm aware of the rules, of course. And I can assure you, my little get-togethers are private affairs that typically end well before midnight." I blinked at her blatant lie. "I'm sorry, but they've gone much later than that," I said gently. "In fact, the last one went until nearly 3 in the morning." She let out a short laugh. "Oh dear, you must be mistaken. Perhaps you're hearing sounds from some other place. Sometimes the wind can carry noise from a few blocks away." A few blocks away? I could literally see the party from my window. But I didn't want to get into a shouting match over the phone. "Well, I can't speak for the wind," I said, "but I do have recordings of the noise that line up exactly with your address. If you wouldn't mind, maybe just lower the volume a bit after midnight." Her voice hardened. "I think we should all remember to be respectful neighbors. That includes not accusing others of wrongdoing without proof. I'm sure you understand. Now, if you don't mind, I have another call to take. Good day." She hung up. I stared at the phone, dumbfounded. Respectful neighbors? This was the same woman who had threatened to fine me for playing an acoustic guitar at 2 in the afternoon. Any illusions I had about a polite resolution were gone. The hypocrisy was too blatant. I realized I needed to gather evidence and present it to the HOA board, or else this one-sided harassment would continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the late-night racket was messing with my sleep. It was time to take a stand. I decided on a strategic approach. Over the next month, whenever Barbara's late-night gatherings started up, I set my phone to record short audio clips from an open window. I also jotted down the exact times, describing what I heard. Saturday, 1 a.m., loud dish-clinking, hearty laughter. Saturday, 2:05 a.m., rowdy cheering, glassware rattling, bursts of applause. At first, I felt a bit sneaky doing this, but I reasoned that if she was going to lie about it and keep complaining about me, I needed airtight proof. Besides, the noise was genuinely disturbing my rest. I often had trouble focusing at work after these late nights. During the day, Barbara continued her routine of policing yard decorations and sending out emails about clutter. Strangely, her condemnation of my daytime music popped up more frequently, almost as if she sensed I was pushing back. One afternoon, I got another official note from the HOA referencing yet another noise complaint from an unnamed neighbor. By now, it was obvious that neighbor was Barbara herself. I typed up a formal response, copying the entire HOA board. In it, I politely wrote, "Dear Magnolia Heights HOA Board and Ms. Farnett, I have received a second notice regarding noise complaints directed at me. However, I believe there is a misunderstanding about what qualifies as unacceptable noise under our bylaws. My music practice occurs exclusively between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., with windows closed. In fact, the bylaws specifically detail quiet hours as 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. Additionally, I have documented instances of late-night noise disturbances after midnight, originating from Ms. Farnett's residence, including audio recordings and timestamps. I would like to request a hearing at the next HOA meeting to clarify these concerns and present evidence of my compliance, as well as evidence of other potential violations. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, my name." I felt a surge of relief after sending this email, copying the board. I hoped it would prompt the other members to take a closer look. Barbara might have some pull, but she wasn't the entire HOA. There were people like Ron Walters, the nominal president, who might be more reasonable. Sure enough, a few days later, I got a reply from Ron himself, politely confirming that my issue would be on the agenda for the next monthly board meeting. Barbara, for her part, didn't respond to my email. Perhaps she was stewing or planning a counterattack. In any case, I prepared my evidence carefully, making sure my audio recordings were labeled with date and time. I even invested in a small decibel meter, just as Barbara had done, to prove that the nighttime noise levels outside her house were far above any acceptable limit. The Magnolia Heights HOA met on the third Thursday of every month at a local community center. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board members typically sat. I arrived about 10 minutes early for the meeting, carrying a folder of printouts detailing my evidence. As residents filtered in, I noticed that Barbara was seated near the front, conferring with a couple of acquaintances. She spotted me briefly but didn't wave or acknowledge me. Instead, she looked away with a stony set to her jaw. Ron Walters, an older, silver-haired gentleman with a kindly demeanor, opened the meeting by running through typical agenda items: upcoming neighborhood events, the Treasury report, landscaping guidelines for the seasonal changes. Then he reached the line item titled Noise Complaints and Resident Hearing Request. "All right," he said, reading from his notes. "We have a resident, Ms. My Name, who has requested to address the board regarding noise complaints directed at her." He paused and lifted an eyebrow. "And also to present evidence of potential nighttime noise violations from another resident's property. Ms. My Name, would you like to come forward?" I stood, clearing my throat. My heart hammered in my chest. Public speaking wasn't my forte, but I knew I had to be composed. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Walters," I began. "I'd like to clarify my side of the noise complaint that has been lodged against me. I practice acoustic guitar during daytime hours, always before 5 p.m. My windows are closed, and my volume is moderate. I have data from a decibel meter showing the maximum levels inside my sunroom at around 60 decibels, which is comparable to normal conversation." I handed a few printed documents to Ron, who passed them to the other board members. Barbara sat stiffly, arms crossed, shooting daggers with her eyes. "Additionally," I continued, "the HOA guidelines for quiet hours explicitly apply from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. I have never played music within those hours. On the other hand, I have documented consistent noise disturbances from Ms. Farnett's address, often continuing past 2 in the morning." I set a stack of papers on the table. Here I have timestamps from multiple weekends, along with short audio clips recorded from my own property, demonstrating the volume of these gatherings. Barbara jolted up. "This is outrageous. I am the HOA compliance officer. I always adhere to the rules. There must be some mistake." Ron held up a hand. "Ms. Farnett, please wait your turn to respond. Let her finish." Barbara's cheeks reddened, but she remained silent, glaring at me. I pressed on. "I don't bring this up to shame anyone, but I have been singled out for playing acoustic guitar during the day, while these late-night parties have genuinely disrupted my sleep. I simply believe the rules should apply fairly. If I'm going to face a complaint, the person issuing it should also be abiding by the same guidelines." I sat down, exhaling quietly. The room buzzed with whispers. Then Ron turned to Barbara. "Miss Farnett, would you like to respond?" She rose, shoulders square, voice tight with indignation. "Yes, I would. First, let me just clarify that these are not parties. They are small social gatherings, sometimes with family or close friends. We are not excessively loud, and we certainly do not go until 3 in the morning as alleged." She looked around, appealing to the board. The complaint about the guitar, however, was not just from me. Several neighbors have mentioned it. Daytime or not, it can be distracting, especially when people work from home. Noise is noise, and the bylaws do say that no resident should cause a disturbance at any time of day. Ron nodded, but he also tapped the papers in front of him. "I see. Though we do have a written policy specifically delineating the nighttime quiet hours as a priority. Also, these decibel readings for the guitar appear relatively low." He flipped through the packet. "Now, Ms. Farnett, do you have any evidence contradicting the times listed for your gatherings? Because Ms. My Name has provided some quite specific logs, and we can see here mention of 2:15 a.m., 2:30 a.m. on multiple occasions." Barbara cleared her throat. "Well, I suppose there might have been a few nights where we lost track of time, but it was nothing that warranted this level of fuss. We're all adults here. A few muffled chuckles rose from the audience. Ron's expression was serious, though. Adults or not, if there's an HOA rule about quiet hours, it applies equally to everyone. Before Barbara could fire back, another board member, a woman named Teresa Chong, spoke up. Ms. Farnett, you've held the role of compliance officer for almost a year now, correct? Yes, Barbara answered, chin raised. You've cited these bylaws multiple times to residents. Are you telling us that you're unsure whether your gatherings might violate the same bylaws you claim to uphold? Barbara's face flushed. I am sure. Well, I believe the gatherings were small enough and the noise minimal. Teresa turned to me. Would you be willing to share your audio evidence? I nodded and held up my phone. Certainly. I have it here. Ron motioned me over. I walked to the board's table, pressed play on one of the clips. Despite the acoustics of the community center, the recording was clear enough. Loud clinking of dishes, bursts of laughter, a few voices calling cheers, repeated times. The timestamp read 2:12 a.m. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably, and I heard a few hushed comments. That's definitely after 10 p.m., someone whispered. Barbara looked downright furious, but she couldn't refute what was plainly audible. Ron let out a soft sigh. Thank you. I think that's sufficient for tonight. He turned to Barbara. Ms. Farnett, in light of this evidence, the board will need to evaluate whether these incidents constitute a violation of our noise rules. As for the guitar complaint, from the data presented, Ms. My name appears to be well within her rights. The decibel levels are quite low, and there's no evidence of nighttime disturbance. The final blow came from Teresa. We'll be discussing whether you should continue in the compliance officer role, Ms. Farnett, given this conflict of interest. Barbara's eyes blazed, but she forced a tight smile. Understood. And with that, the matter was tabled until the board's private deliberations. I returned to my seat, my heart still pounding. I felt a mixture of vindication and unease. Yes, I wanted fairness, but I never imagined I'd be pushing for a potential end to Barbara's short reign as compliance officer. Then again, the hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. A week passed after the HOA meeting. I resumed my normal routine, half expecting to see a smug note from Barbara in my mailbox telling me she'd somehow overruled the board. Instead, I received a pleasant email from Ron Walters stating, Dear Name, the board has reviewed all evidence. We concluded that your daytime music sessions do not violate any HOA noise guidelines. Also, Ms. Farnett's late-night gatherings are indeed in violation of our established quiet hours. We have issued her a formal notice of violation and a fine commensurate with the repeated nature of these disturbances. Please let us know if there are any further problems, and thank you for your patience in addressing this matter. Best regards, Ron Walters, HOA President. I let out a deep breath. A violation and a fine, that was significant. The letter didn't specify the fine's amount, but typically, the HOA's first noise violation penalty was in the range of a few $100s. The board must have decided that was the best course of action. Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy for Barbara. She was, after all, going to be embarrassed by this. But then again, she had harassed me, lied in front of the board, and repeatedly ignored the same rules she enforced so harshly on others. The neighborhood rumor mill moved quickly. Before I even had a chance to mention the resolution, my next-door neighbor, a friendly retiree named Sally, asked me if I'd heard that Karen got fined. I feigned ignorance, though inside, I felt a twinge of relief that people were finally seeing the truth. As for Barbara, she made no attempt to apologize. She avoided me entirely. On trash day, I saw her roll out her bin in the early morning, glancing over at me with narrowed eyes. I waved awkwardly. She huffed, turned away, and went back inside. I guessed it might take a while for her bruised pride to heal. Though the board had officially sided with me, the experience was not exactly smooth sailing from that point onward. Barbara wasn't one to gracefully accept defeat. She doubled down on her micromanagement elsewhere in the neighborhood. People started calling her Karen behind her back even more openly than before. It became a running joke. Better hide the chalk on your driveway before Karen storms over with a bylaw citation. For me, the hostility took a more targeted shape. Every so often, I'd find petty notes taped to my door, typed in the same style Barbara always used for official notices. They'd say things like, Your hedge appears to be encroaching on the sidewalk by 2 inches. Please rectify immediately. Minor cracks in your driveway might cause water seepage. Consider repaving to maintain the HOA standard. None of these issues were actually addressed in the bylaws, which indicated a minimal concern for sidewalk clearance or driveway cracks only when they posed a genuine hazard. My neighbor Sally insisted I ignore them. "She's just trying to push your buttons," Sally said, sipping tea on her porch. "Don't let her drag you into another fight." I nodded but kept the notes in a folder, just in case. If Barbara tried to escalate, I wanted to be able to show a pattern of harassment. Meanwhile, the board had asked her to step down as compliance officer, which she did, albeit with a lot of grumbling. A new volunteer, a retired lawyer named Dave, took over the role. Dave was meticulous but fair, so the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Barbara, however, retained her seat as a voting member of the HOA. Her term wouldn't expire for another few months. She used that position to propose bizarre rules, banning certain mailbox designs, requiring the removal of unsightly wind chimes, and so on. Fortunately, her proposals never won majority support. Still, it was like living with a wasp nest next door. One sting had been neutralized, but the wasp was still buzzing around, ready to strike again at the smallest provocation. Despite Barbara's petty attempts at revenge, I felt freer to enjoy my home. Once again, I practiced guitar in my sunroom, unconcerned about receiving a baseless violation notice. On sunny weekends, I opened the windows just enough to let in a gentle breeze, though I kept the volume moderate out of respect for anyone who might be sensitive to sound. Over time, other neighbors who had been keeping their heads down came out of the woodwork, sharing their own stories of Barbara's overreach. One man said she had threatened to fine him for not trimming his shrubs to the exact same height as his neighbors. Another woman recounted how Barbara scolded her for letting her kids draw with chalk on the sidewalk, calling it graffiti. With each anecdote, I realized how widespread the frustration was. Some neighbors approached me, thanking me for taking Barbara to task. "We were too scared to speak up," one mother admitted, because she made it sound like she had the entire HOA under her thumb. I shrugged. Honestly, I was lucky. I had evidence to back me up. It's not always that simple. The sense of camaraderie warmed my heart. It felt like the neighborhood was uniting in a quiet pushback against her brand of petty tyranny. When the following month's HOA meeting rolled around, I attended, partly out of curiosity, partly to make sure no new nonsense rules were passed. To my mild surprise, Barbara was subdued throughout the meeting. She didn't speak up except to say aye or nay on standard motions like lawn maintenance scheduling. Perhaps she was still licking her wounds from the noise violation fiasco. I couldn't say I felt sorry for her, but I didn't exactly revel in her discomfort either. I just wanted peace. A few weeks later, life in Magnolia Heights seemed to be returning to normal. I was sleeping better. Barbara's late-night dish-clinking parties had either ceased or significantly quieted down. Then, a curious event occurred. The local city council announced it would be re-evaluating the noise ordinances across multiple neighborhoods, including ours. A city newsletter arrived, seeking resident input. "We're considering adjusting the official nighttime quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., possibly shifting them to 9 p.m. to 8 a.m., it explained, referencing new guidelines recommended by a local environmental noise study. The newsletter asked for feedback from HOA boards, who would presumably share the new policy or adopt their own versions. I wasn't too worried about an earlier quiet hour start. I rarely played music past 5 anyway. But I knew that if the city's official quiet hours began at 9 p.m., it could further condemn Barbara's gatherings if she ever let them run late again. Then, to my shock, I got an email from Barbara, this time on her personal account, not through the HOA. The subject read, "Noise Ordinance Discussion." The body was short and civil. "Dear my name, I know we've had our differences, but you seem quite knowledgeable about the existing noise regulations. The city is asking for feedback on proposed changes, and I'd like to discuss them with you. Perhaps we can find some common ground to present to the HOA board. Best regards, Barbara F." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Was this an olive branch? Or a trap? My initial impulse was to ignore her or respond with a cutting remark. But a calmer part of me said that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to bury the hatchet. If she was sincere, we could collaborate to ensure the new regulations were sensible and fair. If she wasn't sincere, at least I'd get a read on her intentions. I replied politely that I was open to a conversation, suggesting we meet at a neutral spot, like the local coffee shop. She agreed to meet that Friday afternoon. Friday came, and I arrived at the Cozy Bean coffee shop around 3 p.m. Barbara was already there, sipping a latte, her pastel cardigan meticulously pressed. She offered a tight smile as I approached. "Hello," I said softly, taking a seat. "Hello," she echoed. An awkward silence followed before she cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming. I realize our history has been complicated, but with the new city noise ordinance on the horizon, I thought we should try to align. We both care about maintaining a pleasant neighborhood." I nodded. "Sure. I agree that having a consistent policy is a good idea. But let me be clear, I want it to be fairly enforced." Her lips pressed together. "Yes, of course. Fair enforcement is crucial. My concern is that if the official quiet hours start too early, it might limit people's normal evening activities, like hosting dinner guests. On the other hand, I do see the need to prevent truly disruptive parties from going past midnight." I couldn't resist a small smirk at the mention of disruptive parties, but I let it slide. I think most neighbors would be fine with a standard 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. cutoff for loud noise. The real issue is when it drags on into the wee hours of the morning. She nodded slowly, a faint flush creeping into her cheeks. I know it might be hard to believe, but I didn't realize how loud my gatherings were. Some nights, we just lost track of time. That's not an excuse, just an explanation. I studied her face, looking for sincerity. She did seem somewhat contrite. "I get it. People have fun, they forget the hour. But you came down on me pretty hard for playing guitar in the middle of the day." She sighed, her hands clasped around her latte cup. "I was new to the role, eager to prove I could uphold the rules. I might have been overzealous. And the complaints about your guitar, well, some neighbors did mention it to me. Perhaps I was too quick to escalate." For a moment, I felt a strange twinge of sympathy. I could see how a new, power-hungry compliance officer might jump to conclusions. Still, her hypocrisy had caused me months of aggravation. "Well," I said carefully, "it's good to hear you admit it. All I ever wanted was for the same rules to apply to everyone." She took a sip of her latte, then exhaled. "It's embarrassing to have received that fine, but it was fair." The corners of her mouth twitched as if she was forcing herself to say the words. "I've already paid it. I'm trying to move on." I nodded. "So, about the new ordinance. Do you think we can draft a joint statement to the HOA board, something balanced? Like, endorsing the city's recommended guidelines, maybe clarifying that moderate noise before 10 p.m. is acceptable, but reasserting that no loud gatherings should continue past midnight." She brightened. "That sounds workable. In fact, I'd be willing to propose that we preserve the 10 p.m. cutoff for Magnolia Heights and just align with any new decibel limits the city suggests." The conversation continued for a little while, focusing on technical details like decibel thresholds and possible exceptions for special occasions. By the end, we'd sketched a rough outline. She insisted on typing it up and sending it to me for review. When we stood to leave, I felt a cautious sense of relief. We hadn't exactly become friends, but maybe we'd turned down the temperature on our feud. If this collaboration stuck, the neighborhood could finally breathe easy. True to her word, Barbara emailed me a draft statement that evening. It was surprisingly balanced, suggesting a 10 p.m. quiet hour start and referencing a maximum decibel level to be measured at a property line. We refined it, then shared it with the HOA board. Ron replied that he appreciated our efforts and would add it to the next meeting agenda. Word spread that Karen and I had met for coffee. Neighbor curiosity ran high. People asked me if the rumors were true that we were now besties. I laughed it off. "We're far from that," I told them. "But maybe we can at least be civil." At the subsequent HOA meeting, Barbara and I presented our joint proposal. The board was somewhat astonished to see us cooperating. After some discussion, they approved the guidelines in principle, with a final vote set for the following month, pending any city-level adjustments. After the meeting, as folks milled around, Sally teased me. "I never thought I'd see the day when you and Barbara Farnett sat side by side at an HOA meeting, calmly discussing decibel limits." I shrugged, a little bemused myself. I guess stranger things have happened. She still rubs me the wrong way sometimes, but at least we're not at war. Barbara lingered by the door, chatting with another board member. She glanced in my direction and gave a polite nod. I returned it. It wasn't a warm smile, but it was an acknowledgement. Perhaps that was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, life in Magnolia Heights settled into a new normal. The updated noise guidelines were officially adopted by the HOA, ensuring that nighttime quiet hours started at 10 p.m. and that day-to-day sounds, like an acoustic guitar before dusk, wouldn't be cause for alarm. A few neighbors breathed sighs of relief, knowing that they could mow their lawns or do minor repairs in the late afternoon without fear of a citation. Barbara, meanwhile, remained on the board until her term expired. She seemed to have lost her appetite for micromanaging, though. Perhaps the noise violation and the subsequent fine had taught her a lesson in humility. She was still reserved toward me. No friendly waves or neighborly chats beyond necessity, but the tension between us had eased considerably. Most importantly, the late-night dish-clinking parties ceased. On the rare occasions Barbara hosted an event, it wrapped up by 11 p.m. The first time it happened, I actually peeked out my window around midnight, surprised by the silent darkness. In a way, it felt like the final exorcism of the old ghosts of petty conflict. Within a year, Barbara moved to a different neighborhood, reportedly for a job transfer. On her last day, I saw her supervising a moving truck in her driveway, methodically directing the movers to load furniture. Part of me wondered if I should say goodbye, but I chose to watch from my yard, uncertain if she even wanted a farewell. A moment later, she spotted me. Our gazes met across the lawn. She hesitated, then raised a hand in a small, tentative wave. I nodded politely. No words were exchanged, but in that silent gesture, we recognized that our feud had ended, imperfectly, but with a measure of understanding. After she drove away, I went back to my sunroom, picked up my guitar, and played a gentle melody. The sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and inviting. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at ease, free to let my music fill the afternoon air without fear of a hypocritical complaint. My new neighbor eventually moved in, a quiet, easygoing woman who never once complained about the guitar. Our block returned to its typical suburban hum, with kids on scooters, dogs barking occasionally, and me strumming chords in the sunroom. In the end, Barbara's attempt to enforce daytime quiet backfired. By complaining about my mild, lawful hobby, she exposed her own late-night hypocrisy. The HOA rightfully fined her, giving her a taste of the very regulations she wielded against others. Though she never quite apologized in a grand gesture, the reversal of roles, her receiving the official violation, was enough of an admission of guilt. We found a shaky truce, ensuring that Magnolia Heights could remain a place of balanced peace. And so it was that I learned how quickly a seemingly small dispute, "Your music is too loud," could escalate into an HOA showdown involving decibel meters, official hearings, and fines. Yet from that confrontation, the neighborhood gained a fairer set of rules, a more sensible approach to noise, and a small measure of unity against overreaching enforcers. For me, that was a happy ending in its own quiet, unassuming way.